Welcome to Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of faith and pop culture and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with Krista Bontrager. Thank you for joining me.
I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, a little bit about you so our viewers know. You have 2 masters, one in Bible exposition and one in theology.
That's right.
So no slacker, right?
Well, I just enjoy the Bible. What can I say?
But you're also RTB's Scholar Community Program Director.
Yes.
So you're well acquainted with our content here and the theology behind it. So something we see kind of common on, on social media that people will criticize the Bible and they'll kind of have questions or doubts about how Christians view Genesis in particular. They'll say it's allegory. And that's kind of a common question even that Christians struggle with. Let's dive into the question of how we can look at the literary genre of Genesis.
Yeah, that's such an important question because the question of is Genesis an allegory, I think is a really thoughtful question. If we have a non-Christian friend who asks us that, that's a great moment to go into a conversation, to dig in a little deeper and to affirm that, there are some rather interesting and kind of odd elements in the first chapters of Genesis. You have a talking snake, you got a guy building a giant ark, you got people living to be 900 years old, you got these strange creatures called the Nephilim. So it's understandable to me why people say that it's allegory. But the question is what is the genre of literature of Genesis, and is it intended to be read as an allegory? And I would say no, that our position here at Reasons to Believe is that Genesis was actually intended to be read as history, that it's recording true and factual events. So that's an important starting point to understanding what we're saying here at Reasons to Believe.
So you say that there are reasons why we believe that it is meant to be understood as historical. So what are some things that we pull from the Bible that give us clues that it's meant to be taken literally? Yeah.
So one of the biggest clues, I think, is actually the New Testament writers and how they view the early chapters of Genesis. Because when they look back, they seem to universally understand even those early stories as being history. Now, Old Testament scholars are very universally agreed that everything from Genesis 12 forward is history. Everything starting with Abraham. The question is what is Genesis 1 through 11? What is that genre of literature? That's really the only point of controversy. Well, when we get to the New Testament, we see things like the gospel writer Luke saying that Jesus was part of Adam's family tree. Well, it would be awfully odd if the whole family tree was all real people, tracing it back. So-and-so begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so. And then we ended at Adam, but he's a mythological creature. That would be weird. The Apostle Paul also seems to believe that Adam is a real person. This is the origin of sin in Romans chapter 5. In 2 Peter chapter 3, the Apostle Peter talks about the flood. And that seems to be a historical event. In fact, it's so important that Peter ties our theology of heaven and the existence of heaven, that heaven exists, and why we know heaven exists is because the flood really happened. So these are real, from the biblical author's standpoint, these are real historical events.
So for some people, and that's all great stuff, but for some people, they might feel like, what does it matter? Why do we have to view Genesis as literal and as historical?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important reason why it matters is that it mattered to Jesus and the apostles. That Jesus talked about Adam and Eve as being real people. And so if we're going to have a view of Scripture that matches Jesus's view of Scripture, I think we need to make the case that Genesis 1 through 11 is real history. The other reason I think that this question is very important is that many of our non-Christian friends who struggle need to know that Genesis and the Bible are rooted and grounded in reality, and that there's something testable there. And so when we're sharing our faith, we want to help bridge that gap between what they know about the physical world through science to what we know about the biblical world and what the Bible tells us about the physical world in the pages of Genesis. So the question of, is Genesis an allegory, is actually a very important question when we're sharing our faith, that we want to let people know, no, we're taking the position Genesis is real history.
So then if someone brings that question to your attention, someone who's kind of doubting, or they're not sure that Christianity and the Bible's grounded in truth and history, what would be like some key points to give to people when they're encountering skeptics?
Well, the most important thing I try to do when I'm talking to my non-Christian friends is create a safe place in the conversation for them to ask a question. That it's not going to be like, oh, that's a dumb question, or why do you believe that, or only people who don't have faith have that question. Rather, to create a space in the conversation, and always try to give them a compliment and make sure it's genuine and it's from your heart, but something along the lines of, that's a great question. Yeah. And I've thought about that too. And, here's some things I've thought about. Or ask them, have you ever actually read the first chapters of Genesis? Like, what did you think about it? What struck you about that? Or what makes you think it's an allegory? Like, what are some of the features that to you point to being an allegory? And let them provide some feedback for you, so then you're getting information of where their mindset is. And it kind of helps reveal where the real stumbling blocks are. So I always try to create a space when someone brings up a thoughtful question is, hey, that's an invitation for us to go to a deeper place in that conversation. And that's an amazing moment. Yeah. So even more than just the allegory question, just asking them, like, what's the question behind the question? Yeah. Why do they think that? Have they ever really read the Bible? Yeah. And maybe you just sit down and you read it together for a couple of chapters and talk about it.
That's great advice, Krista. Thank you so much, Krista. If you want to hear more about this topic, I highly recommend The Bigger Picture on Creation. It's Krista's booklet, and it's available at shop.reasons.org. It's a great resource to help you see more about how Genesis is not allegory and how we can also look at a literal interpretation of Genesis.